The man standing in courtroom 14B looked like he had been worn down by the world itself. His coat was 2 sizes too large, held together at the chest by a single button that had no business still being attached. His boots, if you could still call them that, were wrapped at the toe with electrical tape. His beard was untrimmed, his eyes were tired, and he carried a plastic grocery bag that held everything he owned in the world. His name was called by the clerk in the flat. Bureaucratic tone reserved for people the system had already decided about. Richard Calloway. He stepped forward. Judge Patricia Harmon looked up from her bench with the expression of a woman who had seen this particular story 100 times. Homeless man, municipal violation, wasted morning. She was 53 years old, 20 years on the bench, and she prided herself on efficiency. She looked at Richard Calloway. The way people look at a chair they've already decided not to sit in. "Mr. Calloway," she said, settling her reading glasses on her nose, "you are charged with unlawful encampment on public property, refusal to comply with a lawful order, and obstruction of a municipal officer in the performance of his duties. Do you understand these charges?" "Yes, Your Honor." His voice stopped her. Not dramatically. She didn't drop her gavel or jerk her head back. But something in the clean precision of those 3 words made her index finger pause on the page. "Do you have legal representation?" "No, Your Honor." "Would you like the court to appoint a public defender?" "No, thank you. I'll represent myself." From the gallery someone actually laughed. A short, involuntary sound, quickly swallowed. The court reporter kept her eyes on her machine. The bailiff studied the middle distance. Even the ADA, a sharp young man named Kevin Marsh, who had been practicing for exactly 3 years and dressed like he was already a partner somewhere, allowed himself the smallest smile. The kind men allow themselves when they're absolutely certain they've already won. Judge Harmon studied Richard for one long moment. "That is your constitutional right," she said. "Mr. Marsh, you may proceed." Kevin Marsh stood with the fluid confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life doubted that the floor would hold him. He opened his folder, straightened his already straight tie, and laid out the facts with the crisp certainty of a man reading a verdict that had already been written. Officer Dale Dennison had observed the defendant on the night of October 14th at Riverside Municipal Park. The defendant had constructed an unauthorized campfire within park boundaries. When instructed to extinguish the fire and vacate the premises, the defendant refused. When Officer Dennison attempted to physically escort the defendant from the area, the defendant verbally resisted and refused to move for 11 minutes. The city had zero tolerance for this kind of repeated disruption of public spaces. It was simple. It was documented. It was open and shut. Marsh sat down. Richard Calloway stood up. He didn't approach dramatically. He didn't shuffle papers or clear his throat or do any of the things people do when they're stalling because they're afraid. He simply stood, placed his plastic bag carefully on the table beside him, and looked at Officer Dennison on the witness stand with the calm attention of a man who had all day and knew exactly how to use it. "Officer Dennison," he said, "what was the recorded temperature at 11:47 p.m. on October 14th in this city?" Dennison blinked. "It was cold. I'd say I have the official National Weather Service record for that date and time." Richard reached into his grocery bag and produced a folded piece of paper, printed that morning at the public library 2 blocks from the park where he slept. 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees below freezing. "Your Honor, may I submit this as Exhibit A?" Judge Harmon looked at the paper. She looked at Richard. Something shifted in her face. Not warmth yet, but a door opening. "You may." Marsh was on his feet. "Objection, relevance." "I'll establish relevance in approximately 90 seconds, Richard said, turning calmly toward the bench. "If the court will permit." Judge Harmon looked at him for a beat longer than necessary. "Proceed, Mr. Calloway." Richard turned back to Dennison. "Officer, are you familiar with Cincinnati Municipal Code Section 712-4? Subsection C?" Dennison's jaw tightened. "I know the general. Subsection C states, and I'm reading directly from the city's own published code, that emergency heating provisions create an explicit exception to open flame ordinances when the ambient temperature falls below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, provided that no municipal emergency shelter is available within a reasonable distance to the individual in question." Richard folded the second paper slowly. St. Anthony's. Emergency shelter on Vine Street. The closest facility to Riverside Park. What was its occupancy status on the night of October 14th? Silence. Officer Dennison? I don't know the shelter's capacity situation on that particular. I do. Richard reached into the grocery bag again. This is my rejection slip from St. Anthony's. Time-stamped 8:52 p.m. on October 14th. Shelter full. My name is on the log. I have the carbon copy. He held it up. Your Honor, Exhibit B. The courtroom had gone so quiet that the ventilation system was suddenly audible. Richard placed both documents on the clerk's desk and returned to his position without hurry, without theater, without a single unnecessary word. Officer Dennison, he continued, when you approached me that night and instructed me to leave, did you ask me why I was there? A long pause. No. Did you ask whether I had access to shelter? No. Did you inform me of any alternative resources, warming centers, or overnight options before initiating enforcement? That's not standard procedure. I understand it isn't standard procedure. I'm asking whether you did it. Richard's voice was not unkind. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about it. There was no anger in it, no bitterness, no score settling. It was simply accurate. Did you? No, sir. So to summarize what this court has before it, on a night that was 4 degrees below freezing, with documented proof that I had been turned away from the only available shelter within walking distance, I lit a small fire to avoid freezing to death. In direct accordance with an emergency exception, written into the city's own municipal code, an exception that the responding officer was either unaware of or chose not to apply. He paused. That is the entirety of the prosecution's case. He sat down. For a moment, nobody moved. The court reporter's fingers were still. Kevin Marsh was staring at his folder, with the expression of a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was not in fact solid. Judge Patricia Harmon removed her reading glasses. She was a careful woman. 20 years on the bench had made her careful in the way that surgeons are. Careful, not from timidity, but from the understanding that precision matters, that what you do in these rooms has weight. She looked at Richard Calloway with the full attention she now realized she had withheld from him at the start of this proceeding. Mr. Calloway, she said, and her voice had changed in a way the whole room noticed. This is a remarkably well-constructed legal argument. The subsection citation, the evidentiary preparation, the examination structure, she paused. Where did you study law? The question landed softly. Richard looked at her for a moment, the look of a man deciding something. Harvard Law School, he said. Class of 2002. No one laughed this time. The reporter in the back row sat up straight. The bailiff turned his head. Marsh went still in the way people go, still when something is happening that they don't yet understand, but can feel the shape of. I was a partner at Hargrove and Calloway from 2007 to 2013, Richard continued, in the same even tone he'd used for everything else. Corporate litigation, primarily. Before that, I worked public interest law for 4 years out of school. We argued twice before the Sixth Circuit. He looked down at the table. I was good at it. Judge Harmon set her glasses down entirely. What happened? It was not a question she would normally ask. She knew that, even as she asked it. But the room had tilted on some invisible axis, and the normal rules of courtroom. Distance felt suddenly like the wrong tools for the moment in front of her. Richard was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it had been, measured, clear, but something underneath it had shifted. The way a river sounds different when it gets deep. My son was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder in 2013. Treatment wasn't covered. I liquidated everything. The practice, the house, the accounts. My wife stayed for 2 years. And she tried, she genuinely tried. But watching a person become someone you don't recognize is its own kind of grief. And I don't blame her for leaving. He stopped. The treatment didn't work. Daniel passed away in November of 2015. He was 9 years old. The woman in the second row of the gallery pressed her hand over her mouth. After that, Richard said, I stopped. I don't know how else to say it. I just stopped. Not because I chose to. I don't think it was a choice exactly. I stopped the way a clock stops when the mechanism inside it breaks. I've been outside for 6 years. He looked up at Judge Harmon. I still remember the law. I remember all of it. I remember it the way you remember the language of a country you used to live in. But I haven't had anywhere to put it for a long time. The room was profoundly still. Judge Harmon looked at this man, this hollow-eyed, taped-boot grocery bag man who had just walked into her courtroom and dismantled a prosecution with the quiet precision of someone who had once been exceptional and still was, underneath everything that had happened to him. She thought about how she had looked at him when he first stood up. She thought about the fraction of a second assessment she had made, the mental file she had opened, and the label she had put on it before he had said a single word. She was a fair woman. She believed that about herself. And she understood, sitting here right now, that she had not been fair. That the fairness she prided herself on had a blind spot. And his name was Richard Calloway. And he was standing in front of her in borrowed clothes with a dead son-in-law, degree and every reason in the world to be angry, and somehow was not. She cleared her throat. "All charges against Mr. Calloway are dismissed," she said. "The evidence clearly supports the application of Municipal Code 712.04c, and the city failed to demonstrate any basis for prosecution in the presence of that exemption." She paused. "Mr. Marsh, I would recommend a review of officer training, protocols regarding emergency provisions and enforcement discretion. That recommendation will appear in my written order." Marsh nodded without looking up. Judge Harmon looked at Richard directly. "Mr. Calloway, the court cannot give you back what you've lost. I want to be clear that I'm not standing here pretending that a dismissed misdemeanor charge is anything close to adequate." She stopped, and when she continued, her voice had stepped outside the formal register for the first time. "But there is a legal aid organization that operates out of this building, the Hamilton County Reentry Initiative. They work with people who have law backgrounds and need a path back. I know the director personally." She pulled a notepad toward her, wrote something, tore the page off, and handed it to the bailiff, who carried it across the room to Richard. "That's her direct number. She's expecting my call." Richard took the paper. He looked at it for a long time. "I didn't come here for help," he said quietly. "I know you didn't," Judge Harmon said. "You came here to defend yourself. And you did." She looked at him over the space of the room. "But you've been defending yourself alone for a very long time. Mr. Calloway, maybe that's enough of that." Richard Calloway stood in that courtroom, in his taped boots and his too large coat, with his plastic bag and his Harvard education and his 9-year-old boy who had been gone for 8 years, and he looked down at the piece of paper in his hand. He didn't cry. He had gotten very far past crying, but something moved across his face that everyone in that room saw, and none of them would ever be able to fully describe. Something that looked like a man remembering, very faintly and from a great distance, what it felt like to be seen. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in his chest pocket, close. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. He picked up his grocery bag. He walked to the door, and when he pushed it open and stepped out into the pale October light, the woman in the second row was openly crying. The court reporter was staring at her machine without seeing it, and Kevin Marsh was sitting very still, staring at the floor, thinking about every case he had ever stood up and called open and shut. Judge Patricia Harmon sat alone at her bench for a moment after the room had emptied. She picked up her phone and dialed the director of the Hamilton County Reentry Initiative. "Carol," she said when the line picked up, "I'm sending someone to you. His name is Richard Calloway." A pause. "Yes, take care of him." She hung up, straightened her papers, and called the next case. But for the rest of that day, and for many days after, she thought about a man who had walked into her courtroom with nothing, and had been, quietly and without asking anyone's permission, still everything he had ever been.